Airta.
In Formula One, a race winner is not supposed to start from 22nd on the grid. There's a reason why there are qualifying sessions. It is the first step in distinguishing pretenders from contenders. That is why a car that starts from so far back on the grid usually finishes a far distance from the winner, or retires. But in Long Beach, in 1983, without rain or any external circumstances to explain it, John Watson won it after starting the race from the 22nd position. And his teammate Niki Lauda finished in second after he started from the 23rd position. It was a unique race in the annals of the sport, and so many years later, we still have a difficult time trying to explain the results. This is why the 1983 United States Grand Prix West is a race to remember. The 1983 Long Beach Grand Prix was a race filled with nonsense. It was because the man who won it, Irishman John Watson, should never have been able to realize such an achievement. Winning a Grand Prix by a 30-second margin after having started from the 22nd place on the grid simply should not have happened. Even in the 1980s, when there was a wider range of race winners, finishing first after having started out from the 22nd spot was such an absurdity that it would not even be possible in 2024, as that spot position on the grid no longer exists. The 1983 Long Beach Grand Prix, officially called the United States Grand Prix West, also made no sense because Watson's teammate, Austrian Niki Lauda, managed to finish second from even further back on the grid, kicking off his race in the 23rd spot. He too should never have been able to accomplish what he did. Through a judicious choice of tires for a race that was going to be unforgivable on this feature, combined with an array of incidents that would slow or eliminate many of the front runners, enabled one of the most incredible and spectacular comebacks in the history of the sport. This scenario happened at a time when it was difficult to determine who were the front runners for the championship, as no team had truly displayed any domination. This race in Long Beach was the second in the 1983 season that followed a 1982 year where the battle for the championship had been wide open. But the conclusion of the 1982 calendar left a sour taste in the mouths of many when K.K. Rosberg conquered an abnormal title. Rosberg's conquest was looked down upon. For them, he was the driver who benefited the most from the injuries that cost the career of the man who led the championship at the time, Didier Pironi, then a driver who had decisively beaten every other opponent. The fact that the Williams driver had won just a single race during the season also caused a major uneasiness about the legitimacy of the Finns' title. Added to this was the fact that Rosberg had been a late, desperate pickup by Frank Williams, who found himself out of options after his star driver Alan Jones had made him wait weeks and months before officially confirming that he would not be returning for the 1982 season. When Jones, who ironically made his F1 return in the Arrows car during the 1983 Long Beach Grand Prix, decided to stay in Australia for the 1982 season, all the renowned drivers had already signed elsewhere, and Williams had to choose amongst the leftovers, those who were unemployed by the others. One of those drivers was Rosberg, who had, weeks before, made a decision unseen in F1 when he resigned from his drive with the Fittipaldi team. For many in the F1 universe, it was clear that Williams was empty-handed after Jones's refusal and that Frank Williams had to put somebody, at this point anyone, in the car. To see Rosberg, who was practically considered a reject by the entire F1 universe, win the Drivers' Championship with only one victory during the year was definitely not good enough for them or the sport. Rosberg was completely aware of this sentiment. Therefore, at the outset of the following 1983 season, he was determined to prove that the title he had won the previous year was not a fluke. The Long Beach Grand Prix being the second race of the season, Rosberg was resolute in wanting to show his talent. This following his Race 1 disqualification in Brazil. Now at Long Beach, he had only one goal in mind: to impress. Another driver that had a tough time during the offseason was John Watson. The arrival of Niki Lauda in the McLaren team, for whom he had driven over many seasons, at the beginning of 1982, it was seen for what it was: a statement that McLaren's new boss, Ron Dennis, did not fully have faith in him to reach the highest summits. In 3 races since his return to F1, Lauda was already on top step of the podium in Long Beach. It was practically symbolic in that Lauda had already put Watson in his place. Then Watson had a good 1982 season. He won 2 races, Belgium and Detroit, and finished second in the championship with 39 points, but it was basically considered irrelevant. Everyone had their eyes on the double world champion Lauda and wondered what he could do in the McLaren car. Between the end of 1982 and the beginning of the 1983 season, Watson and Dennis waited an extremely long time before reaching an agreement. For a while, it was clear that the team was looking for greener pastures, but the performances of the red and white car were not good enough to attract top talent, and it was late into the offseason where McLaren and Watson decided to spend one more year together. The behavior by McLaren was anything but a mark of confidence. At the time of the Long Beach Grand Prix, a popular circuit where the F1 would run for the last time in 1983, there were 3 F1 tire manufacturers: Goodyear, Michelin, and Pirelli, the 3 equipping several respectable cars. That meant that there were almost endless options and possibilities for the drivers and their teams to choose in preparation for a race. In that era, the driver's feeling in choosing the compound for the race often turned out to be the determinant factor between a good and a bad day at the track. One thing was for certain, it would almost always be the team who made the best tire selections that would go on to win the races. It would be the case again here at Long Beach. It was possibly the best example in the era of a team benefiting from a good tire choice to entirely change the outcome of a race. The qualifying session had been difficult for most of the drivers. On Friday, a good portion of the competitors complained about a bump on the circuit that could break their suspensions during the race. On the Saturday, the necessary work had been carried out to correct the issue, and the dent no longer presented a danger for race day. Both qualifying sessions were a Ferrari affair, as René Arnoux clocked the best time on Friday, but he was beaten by his teammate Patrick Tambay on the Saturday. It's the latter that would have the best time and start at first. On second row, we find the 2 Williamses. World champion Keke Rosberg is third on the grid, while Jacques Laffite is at fourth. Both drivers, who would fight for the championship until the last race of the season, will not be relevant during this day. Alain Prost on Renault is 8th on the grid, while Nelson Piquet is way back in 20th place, his Michelin tires having apparent trouble finding a rhythm. As we saw, John Watson and Niki Lauda were at the bottom of the grid in 22nd and 23rd place, respectively. Their best time during the qualifying session ringing in at around 4 seconds slower than the time of the pole set by Tambay. McLaren was not quite a contender at the time, and they were on Michelin tires that seemed to cause so much trouble for Piquet, the winner of the first race of the season 2 weeks prior, that no one expected anything good from the red and white cars during this race. They were so far behind that it was as if they did not exist during the first portion of the race. Adamant, Rosberg was spectacular at the start. His car appeared to want to spin, but he was able to maintain control and overtake both Ferraris in the maneuver. The 2 Scuderia drivers were having an okay start at best, but were unable to go as fast as Rosberg. But the Finn, as he searched for a way to go beyond the red cars, chose to go between the 2, hitting Arnaud's Ferrari in the process. The Frenchman's race would suffer from the results of that collision. After having just enough time to let Rosberg take the lead, Tambay was able to benefit from the power of his turbo engine. There was a long straight before the first corner, and he caught the world champion. With the 2 now running side by side along Shoreline Drive towards the first corner. Tambay had the inside track, and he managed to keep first place on Rosberg. But it took more than that to cool the Finnish driver. Rosberg battled hard with Tambay, and he was just behind the French driver, looking to go back in the lead. In reality, Rosberg was just too aggressive. He braked too late and lost control at the end of the second straight on the track on Seaside Way. His Williams went into a spin, and he was quite lucky not to hit Tambay, or the wall for that matter, and was able to regain control of his vehicle. In the process, Laffite passed him. At the end of the first lap, the order was now Tambay, Laffite, Rosberg, Michele Alboreto on Tyrrell, Arnoux, and Danny Sullivan on the other Tyrrell. Meanwhile, Watson was 20th with Lauda at 22nd. Alboreto had a very good start. He was already fourth after starting seventh on the grid. He overtook Arnoux during the first lap as the Ferrari driver still had trouble finding his rhythm, following the earlier contact with Rosberg. On the second lap at the Toyota corner, the first following the start-finish line, Riccardo Patrese on Brabham got the better of Sullivan and overtook sixth place. Meanwhile, Rosberg kept his focus and overtook Lafitte to regain second place. At the moment he saw Rosberg heading in front of him, Lafitte told himself that his teammate did not do enough to save his tires. But Rosberg's goal was clear, catching Tambay. As of the third lap, he was only a mere 3.2 seconds behind. It took 5 laps for Rosberg to achieve his goal. On lap 8, he was back right in the gearbox of the Frenchman. This was shaping up to be a great battle between the two. Now that Rosberg was just behind the Ferrari, we noticed at that moment that all the cars were very close to one another. Rosberg was near Tambay, but Lafitte was close to Rosberg. Alboreto was close to Lafitte, but Arnoux was close to Alboreto. The top 6 found themselves grouped together in a confined space on the track. That was on lap 10. But the one who clearly put on the most pressure was, without a doubt, Rosberg. He did what he had to do to ensure that Tambay saw him in his rearview mirror in different corners along the track. Meanwhile, the Ferrari driver handled things differently than Rosberg. Tambay's reality was far different from those of his main contenders. He tried as hard as he could to be smooth with his tires while he contained his Williams opponent. Tambay knew that he had to save his tires. It was necessary if he wanted to go far and do well on this day. Despite the heavy pressure, Tambay managed to stay first. Rosberg was very close in time but was never in a position to actually overtake the French driver. Through the first laps, Tambay was driving really well. That would last for much of the race. To show how tight things were, after lap 15, Tambay led, but Rosberg was just 0.3 of a second behind. Lafitte was third, 1.6 seconds behind Tambay, and Alboreto was in fourth spot at 2.1 seconds off Tambay. Riccardo Patrese, Eddie Cheever on Renault, and Jean-Pierre Jarier on Ligier were close, around 6 seconds behind the leader. Jarier was quite fast since the beginning of the race. He even clocked the fastest lap until that point, realizing the feat on lap 8. If he continued like that, the experienced driver could cause a surprise. Meanwhile, there are all the reasons in the world to forget about the McLaren drivers. They gained a few places since the beginning of the race, but it is mostly due to the problems of the cars in front of them. No one gave them any attention on lap 16 as they ran only 12th and 13th. The fact that they are almost irrelevant by this juncture, it allowed them to run at a very good pace without being noticed. Their Michelin tires worked well on this day, and the normally aspired Cosworth engine did not seem to be a disadvantage. They had an impressive pace, but nobody was aware. Their adversaries still on the track would have a big surprise later on in the race. In front, Rosberg continued to push hard, but without really trying any special moves on Tambay. It was as though he was waiting for a mistake, or he was simply unable to get close enough. It could have been that he had learned his lesson through his frightening spin-out during the first lap. On lap 18, Tambay slightly missed the apex at the hairpin, and that would be enough to allow Rosberg to place himself right in the gearbox of the Ferrari as both drivers exited the corner. But the Ferrari engine was powerful enough to allow Tambay to keep first place, as Rosberg was not able to catch the red car in the straight after the start-finish line. Clearly, Rosberg was not on his last attempts to catch Tambay. There was no way that he would allow the leader to drive with peace of mind. Not at all. A lap later, Rosberg headed towards the outside of Tambay along Shoreline Drive. But Tambay had the apex at the corner and retained his edge. Tambay kept his line all along, and Rosberg was unable to overtake him. We do not know if the Finnish driver's inability to pass in front upset him, but his driving clearly gave that impression. Consequences of his late braking and his unusual race line, Rosberg now needed to defend on Lafitte as they approached the corner at the end of the Seaside Way straight. But Lafitte would not go kamikaze on his teammate, and Rosberg kept second place. On the 20th lap, Jarier continued at his surprising pace and overtook Patrese. Although Jarier was now in 5th place, he was very close to the leader on the track. only 3.6 seconds behind Tambay, as the first 5 cars were running in a group. Jarier now began to animate the race. He was very fast at the time and not very patient. He tried to pass Alboreto for 4th place, but was not able to succeed. On lap 23, he tried again, but braked very late and in fact missed the curve. He forced his car on the inside of Alboreto, and because Jarier's Ligier blocked the corner while it continued off the racing line, the Italian had no space to turn. He was stuck in that spot and had to place the brake to escape a collision. Patrese, just behind, was the one who benefited from Jarier's kamikaze attempts. He overtook both drivers. Patrese is now in 4th, Jarier at 5th, and Alboreto 6th. It's on lap 26 that Rosberg carried out the fatal attack on Tambay. That would dash the hopes of the French, but the hopes of the Finns too. When Rosberg arrived at the hairpin, he literally plunged into the corner and braked away, way too late. In fact, he had to brake so very hard because he was simply unable to take the corner. Tambay had not yet seen it or decided to continue with the usual racing line, but he was touched by the drifting Williams of the world champion. The Ferrari was then partially lifted into the air before it fell hard to the ground. Now, Tambay's car was stuck on the track while Rosberg went around the Ferrari and continued on its path. Tambay could do nothing else other than lift his arm to warn of his presence. As we previously mentioned, all this happened when many adversaries were very close behind Tambay and Rosberg. At the moment the resultant contact was felt, Laffite and Jarier were already there. The 3 cars of Rosberg, Laffite, and Jarier then went in sync, together, side by side on the track. The next corner would decide who would take first place in the race. But when the 3 cars arrived at the corner where everything was on the line, Rosberg slowed his car and retired. He and Jarier had touched, and the latter too would have to retire due to the contact. Rosberg was too optimistic by trying to overtake Laffite from the outside, where it was simply not possible. The same fate awaited Jarier, who then missed a very rare opportunity to lead a Grand Prix. His boss, Guy Ligier, would be infuriated at his driver with this outcome. After it occurred, he stated, "It's so stupid. Jarier's collision with Rosberg was ridiculous. He could have escaped it. He just lost a great opportunity for a win." It is when he braked dramatically to take the corner from the outside of the apex that Jarier, who was also very optimistic, hit the Finnish driver's Williams. Now both their races were over. Same for Tambay, who got out of his car at the hairpin, dejected by the result of Rosberg's maneuver. In 2 corners, the race had lost its leaders. Tambay, the best driver since the start in Rosberg, and a non-invited guest who was looking to make a lot of noise in Jarier. Laffite was now the leader. And just like that, he now ran without the main opponents that he had surrounded himself since the beginning of the Long Beach course to annoy or challenge him. Almost unnoticed because, as it occurred at the same time of the accident in front, Alboreto went to his pits. He was now no longer amongst the leaders. But Laffite had to be careful because Patrese on Brabham was still close, only 2.2 seconds behind. With the retirement of Tambay, Rosberg, and Jarier, this was a huge opportunity for a win for Patrese. Far behind the leader, we could see that Lauda had ended the 26th lap at 5th place, followed closely by Watson in 6th. Both McLaren drivers went from 22nd and 23rd at the start to 5th and 6th in 26 laps. Impressive. Indeed, many drivers in front of them suffered from accidents or had retired, but since the beginning, their pace was great, and they were well positioned to take advantage of the misfortune of the favorites. They were now only 20 seconds behind the new leader, Laffite, so people began to notice their presence on the track. After the hustle and bustle, the race needed a bit of peace and quiet. Patrese continued to follow Laffite around 2 seconds behind for numerous laps. He waited for a mistake that never arrived. Meanwhile, both Lauda and Watson overtook Mark Surer of the Arrows and Johnny Ceccato with Theodore Racing. Lauda was now 3rd and Watson 4th. They were still around 20 seconds behind the leaders. It's at this moment that many sensed the McLaren cars were onto something special, and Watson was more determined than ever to be the one to reap the rewards. On lap 33, the Irishman was now right on his teammate's tail. Lauda, understanding that this battle was lost, let Watson, who locked his wheels, on through. Watson was now in third place, cutting the lead of both Laffite and Patrese, while in the process of chasing Lauda. He was now 15 seconds behind the two drivers. If he could continue at this pace, both he and Lauda could catch the leaders. Up front, Laffite's tires remained a concern. With 40 laps to go, that was still a long stretch of driving remaining. The Williams driver had no intention of changing his tires during the race, so he continued to drive accordingly. Patrese was still close, but the Italian does not pose a threat to Laffite. But it was soon apparent that the McLaren were gaining fast on the two leaders, Watson cutting their lead by 3 seconds in just one lap. And then the gap became smaller and smaller as the laps went on. By lap 40, Watson was only 9 seconds behind Laffite. On lap 41, Lauda realized the fastest lap of the day, 1 minute, 28 seconds and a half, a time that the Austrian would break only one lap later. That lap, 42, would become the fastest lap of the race at a meager 1 minute, 28.3 seconds. That happened at a time when Patrese really did not try anything on Laffite, the real threat coming only from the McLarens. Now Watson had Laffite in sight when he ran on the two straights of the circuit. On lap 44, Patrese was surprised by an attack coming from Watson at the end of the shoreline drive. He then missed his braking and continued in the runway. He was able to come back on the track, but both McLaren cars were way ahead of him by now. Unfortunately for Laffite, that meant that Patrese would not be able to help him by slowing down Watson or Lauda. At that point, with their pace, it appeared to be a sure thing that the McLaren would eat Laffite alive. It was effectively what happened. On lap 45, Watson overtook the Williams driver. The Frenchman resisted as much as he could, but he was really unable to do much. The pace of the McLaren was just that much faster. Watson passed him at the same spot where he overtook Lauda, at the end of Shoreline Drive, right at the Toyota corner. Laffite tried to block him by moving from his usual racing line by heading towards the middle of the track, but Watson was able to pass at the inside by braking later at the corner. He then continued on his way like it was nothing. Overtaking Laffite for the lead was that easy for the Irish driver. Watson was now first with 30 laps to go. About 5 seconds later, Lauda copied his teammate and took care of Laffite to place himself in second position. It was at this point where it became evident that Laffite had serious concerns over the state of his tires. The Goodyear on his Williams were less performant than during the qualifying session, contrary to the Michelins that the McLarens were using. It was difficult to understand why Williams had not yet changed them by this point. The French manufactured tires were a large part of the explanation behind the masterful performance by both McLaren drivers. But Watson, now that he was in the lead, was slightly better than his double world champion teammate on this day. He had proven his worth by passing him, having made a better choice of tires for the race between the many options available to him. He was quite comfortable in the lead of the race. Lauda was no longer a threat to him. Nothing seemed to disturb him. He only had to continue his drive, and it looked like this race would be another win on his resume. Meanwhile, the poor state of Laffite's tires continued to affect him as Patrese found a way to go in front of him on lap 52. Laffite was suffering a lot on the track now, and there were still 23 more laps to go. At this point in the race, all eyes were only turned towards McLaren. If Watson and Lauda were able to keep their places until the finish line, it would be the first 1-2 finish for the team since 1968. Even when their driver Emerson Fittipaldi won the championship in 1974 and in 1976 with James Hunt, they were never able to realize a 1-2 finish. As the race progressed, Watson continued to build his lead on Lauda. He widened the gap with every lap. It was the same for Patrese and Laffite, who kept losing ground. On lap 60, they were more than 40 seconds behind. The McLarens were simply on another level. Later, 3 laps before the end, Patrese would have to retire. Laffite, on his side, would have to concede third place to René Arnoux, who had found a surprising pace as the race neared its end. But he was still more than a minute behind the winner. As the race was nearing its finish, and with it the end of F1 cars' reign on the Long Beach circuit, Arnoux found a way to distinguish himself when he made a stunningly great move, overtaking both Lafitte and American Eddie Cheever on Renault at the same time. That was on lap 66. At this point, Lafitte was so slow that he left the inside of the corner to his rivals, and Arnoux surprised Cheever right there by taking the apex right before his eyes. The Ferrari then overtook the Renault and the Williams to take fourth place. It was a great move by Arnoux, happily not hiding it in the anonymity of the middle of the pack. But it was not over between he and Cheever. The latter, at home on American soil, retook Arnoux a couple of corners later. This was a good battle between the two, but Arnoux ended it not too long after when he went right in front of his ex-team's Renault car for good. That was helped by the fact that Cheever suddenly retired at the same time. But this battle was far from being a concern for Watson, who took the checkered flag after 75 laps. Lauda had slowed when the race was almost in the books and finished 30 seconds behind. Safe to say, after starting as far back on the grid as one almost possibly could, McLaren had totally annihilated the opposition this day. It was dumbfounding. Watson raised his arms in a sign of victory when he crossed the finish line. His win was a shocking one. No one would have imagined seeing the McLaren come back in the way it did and lead the race by that much at the end. The winner, Watson, declaring, "Don't ask me how I did it," adding the obvious, nobody can expect to win while starting so far back on the grid. But as I understand, our victory was helped by some incidents at the front. This win was one of the most inexplicable in the history of F1. Sure, the Michelin tires had helped a lot, but to this extent? For Watson, it was a fifth career victory, but this would be his last. His F1 career ending abruptly in the offseason. Like it was for 1983, the contract talks for 1984 were uneasy between the Watson and McLaren clans. When Alain Prost was fired by Renault, McLaren signed him as the Frenchman was clearly one of the best in the world, maybe the driver of the future. McLaren, who was then with a turbo-tag Porsche engine, simply could not pass on the possibility of signing a driver of his magnitude. With a Lauda-Prost duo in 1984, the McLaren tag Porsche team would own the season. Watson would drive a race for McLaren 2 years later in 1985 when Lauda was injured. But he finished more than a lap behind his teammate Prost, who on that day won his first championship. John Watson's career in F1 came to a close in this race at Brands Hatch. But this Long Beach win really remained as one of the greatest anomalies in the history of the sport. Even now, over 40 years later, F1 fans wondered how such a comeback was even possible, and they are still looking for answers. For Watson, it was one of the defining days of his career. A truly special, difficult-to-explain win, but still a magnificent drive. So beautiful that the McLaren mechanics were laughing after the race, saying that the next time they would win even from DNQ, the did not qualify position. They did not know it then, but it was definite foreshadowing, as the next race in Monaco, both McLarens would effectively fail to qualify. This ineptitude showing once again how the win in dominating fashion in Long Beach was almost inexplicable. As for Rosberg, he would remember this race as one where he pushed the envelope too far. But his day would come. At the next round, he would drive a superb race, and this time he was able to put everybody in their place as he dominated the Monaco Grand Prix. It was accepted that after the Monte Carlo win that indeed Rosberg was a driver of the caliber of a world champion. For this race, the author was assisted by watching footage from the race on the F1 TV app, the race report in the French magazine Sport Auto by Gérald Jaby Crombach, the race report by Motorsport magazine journalist Dennis Jenkinson, watching footage from the race on Dailymotion, and the website statsf1.com. For executive producer Simon Bachand, I'm Jeremy Zaffron for A Race to Remember.